Walk into any grocery store in September 2025, and you'll see it. The price tags have crept higher. The receipt at checkout makes you wince. Your paycheck, which felt comfortable a few years ago, now barely covers the basics. The government tells you inflation is at 3%, under control, cooling. Yet somehow, everything still feels impossibly expensive. Here's what they're not telling you. The 3% figure captures only part of the story. Beneath that headline number lies a web of hidden costs that official statistics never measure. Shrinking product sizes, declining quality, wages that can't keep pace, housing that's permanently out of reach. These are the invisible taxes on your purchasing power, the quiet erosion of your standard of living that happens while economists declare victory over inflation. 2025 isn't just another year of rising prices. It's a revelation, a moment when the gap between what the data says and what you experience becomes impossible to ignore. This is the story of what inflation really costs, how it's measured versus how it's felt, and why the hidden expenses matter far more than the numbers on the evening news. In September 2025, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the Consumer Price Index rose 3% compared to September 2024. This represented a slight uptick from the 2.9% recorded in August. The monthly increase was 0.3%, driven largely by a 4.1% jump in gasoline prices, the largest monthly increase since August 2023. Food prices climbed 3.1% over the year. Shelter costs, the largest component of most household budgets, continued their steady rise. Core inflation, which excludes volatile food and energy prices, also came in at 3% annually. This measure matters because it shows underlying price pressures beyond temporary spikes in gas or groceries. At 0.2% monthly growth, core inflation suggests price increases have become structural, not merely reactive to short-term disruptions. Federal Reserve officials watch these numbers closely. Their target is 2% annual inflation, a goal they haven't consistently hit since early 2021. At 3%, inflation remains elevated but far below the peak of 9.1% reached in June 2022. By historical standards, 3% isn't catastrophic. From 1914 to 2024, average inflation ran around 3.3%. The problem isn't the number itself, it's what the number doesn't capture. The Consumer Price Index measures price changes for a basket of goods and services meant to represent typical consumer spending. Government statisticians track around 80,000 items, from bread and gasoline to haircuts and hospital visits. They weight these items according to how much the average household spends on each category. The result is a single figure meant to summarize the inflation experience of millions of people. But no single number can capture every household's reality. If you rent rather than own, your experience differs from the homeowner. If you drive long distances for work, gasoline price spikes hit you harder. If you have young children, childcare and education costs dominate your budget in ways the average basket doesn't reflect. And, crucially, the CPI measures only price changes, not quality changes or size reductions. It assumes you're still getting the same value for your dollar. That assumption, in 2025, is increasingly questionable. Enter shrinkflation, the practice of reducing product sizes while keeping prices constant. It's inflation in disguise, hidden in packaging that looks almost the same as before. Manufacturers have perfected this art over recent years, and 2025 has seen the trend accelerate. Consider toothpaste. Reports have documented cases like Aquafresh reducing tube sizes from 100 milliliters to 75 milliliters while maintaining similar pricing, effectively increasing the per-unit cost by over 100%. That's not 3% inflation appearing in headlines. That's a doubling of your real cost. And it doesn't show up in the CPI because the official price per tube may not have changed dramatically relative to the specific formulation the government tracks. Or take products like Gaviscon, where similar size reductions have been documented. When a 600 milliliter container shrinks to 500 milliliters while the price remains constant, that represents a 20% per unit price increase. If you use such products regularly, you're paying significantly more over time, buying more bottles to get the same amount of relief. Coffee, that morning staple, has seen similar shrinkage. Major brands have quietly reduced jar sizes while maintaining shelf prices. Cereal boxes that once held 18 ounces now hold 15 or 16. Chip bags that contain 12 ounces now contain 10. The pattern repeats across categories. Candy bars, ice cream containers, paper towels, laundry detergent, everything is getting smaller. In Japan, where cultural norms make direct price increases difficult, shrinkflation has become so pervasive that a consumer created a website documenting hundreds of examples. His frustration began with chocolate biscuits that kept shrinking. Now he tracks everything from snacks to household goods, showing exactly how much less Japanese consumers receive for their money. The practice has spread globally. In the United States, Senator Bob Casey introduced legislation to classify shrinkflation as an unfair or deceptive practice, directing the Federal Trade Commission to take action against companies that engage in it. France took action on this issue. As of 2024, French retailers must flag products that have been reduced in size without a corresponding price cut. When you shop, you'll see notifications telling you the product has shrunk. This transparency matters because shrinkflation is designed to escape notice. Companies bet that consumers won't calculate per-unit prices, won't compare current packages to old ones sitting in their pantry, won't realize they're being charged more for less. The cumulative effect is substantial. Analysis suggests that even seemingly insignificant reductions, 5% here, 10% there, add hundreds of dollars to annual grocery bills. You're not buying more food. You're buying the same amount in smaller packages, requiring more frequent purchases at higher per-unit costs. This is hidden inflation that CPI calculations largely miss, and it's eroding your purchasing power silently, transaction by transaction. But shrinkflation has a cousin that's even harder to detect. Skimpflation, the practice of maintaining product size while reducing quality. Same box, cheaper ingredients. Same bottle, weaker formula. Same package, inferior materials. Fast food chains reduce the amount of chicken in enchiladas or pork in sausages, substituting cheaper proteins or fillers. Laundry detergent manufacturers decrease the concentration of active cleaning agents, so clothes don't come as clean even though you're using the same amount of product. Paper towels become thinner, tearing more easily. Chocolate bars use less cocoa, more vegetable oils. The changes are subtle enough that most consumers don't notice immediately. You just gradually realize your favorite product doesn't work as well as it used to. This quality erosion doesn't appear in inflation statistics at all. The CPI assumes products remain constant. It measures price per item, not value per item. When companies cut quality to preserve profit margins during inflationary periods, they're effectively raising prices without the price tag changing. You pay the same amount for an inferior product, which means you're getting less for your money. That's inflation by another name. For consumers, skimpflation erodes trust. You develop loyalty to brands based on consistent quality. When that quality silently degrades, the relationship feels like a betrayal. But companies argue they're making necessary adjustments to survive in inflationary environments. Rising input costs, supply chain pressures, and labor expenses force difficult choices. They can raise prices overtly, risking customer backlash and lost market share. Or they can make subtle product changes, hoping consumers won't notice or won't care enough to switch brands. The strategy works because detecting quality changes requires attention and memory. You need to remember how the product performed months or years ago and compare it to today's performance. Most people don't track such details. They adapt, assuming they must be using the product incorrectly or their standards have changed. This psychological aspect makes skimpflation particularly insidious. You blame yourself for dissatisfaction rather than recognizing you're receiving objectively less value. Now let's talk about what matters most, your paycheck. Because inflation means nothing if your income keeps pace. If wages rise as fast as prices, purchasing power stays constant. You're not actually worse off. But that's not what's happening. Since January 2021, real wages, meaning wages adjusted for inflation, have declined. Data through mid-2025 indicates purchasing power down approximately 0.7% from where it stood 4.5 years ago. That might sound small, but consider what it represents. Despite nominal wage increases of around 19.7% during that period, prices rose approximately 21.5% according to analysis of Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Your paycheck number got bigger, but it buys less than before. The damage was concentrated in a brutal 25-month stretch from April 2021 to April 2023. During this period, inflation outpaced wage growth every single month, according to Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta data. Your raises couldn't keep up with rising costs. Every month, you fell further behind. Purchasing power eroded steadily, month after month, creating a cumulative loss that even subsequent wage gains haven't fully recovered. According to analysis from Moody's Analytics cited in financial reporting, the typical American household was spending significantly more per month in 2025 to purchase the same goods and services they bought a year earlier. Compared to early 2021, before the current inflation surge began, households face substantially increased monthly expenses. Over $12,500 in additional annual spending for the same standard of living appears to be a reasonable estimate based on cumulative inflation effects. If your wages haven't increased by at least that much, you're objectively worse off. But the real wage crisis extends far beyond the recent inflation surge. Looking at longer time horizons reveals an even more troubling picture. Analysis by the Pew Research Center found that real hourly earnings for the average American worker have barely budged since 1978. After adjusting for inflation, today's average hourly wage has about the same purchasing power it had over 4 decades ago. We've essentially gone sideways for an entire generation. For more than 4 decades, productivity has increased dramatically. Workers produce more value per hour than ever before. Technology, education, and capital investment have made American workers extraordinarily productive. Yet compensation hasn't kept pace. Research has shown that from 1973 to 2013, productivity grew substantially, while hourly compensation grew far less. The gap has only widened since, suggesting that productivity gains have flowed primarily to capital rather than labor. Where did those productivity gains go? Primarily to capital, not labor. Corporate profits surged, executive compensation skyrocketed, shareholders reaped dividends and buybacks, but ordinary workers saw minimal benefit. The system delivered gains to those who own assets, not those who sell labor. This dynamic, ongoing for generations, means inflation hits workers harder than ever. They have no cushion, no accumulated wealth from previous prosperous periods, just stagnant wages meeting rising costs. Since May 2023, there's been modest improvement. Nominal wage growth has finally exceeded inflation consistently, allowing real wages to rise slightly. But this positive trend hasn't erased the losses accumulated during the 2021 to 2023 period. You're climbing out of a hole, not reaching new heights. And for many workers, particularly in lower wage sectors, the recovery remains uneven. Those in management and professional roles appear to have captured most of the wage growth. Those at the bottom continue struggling. This wage stagnation explains why 3% inflation feels so devastating. If real wages had been rising robustly for decades, workers would have buffers, savings, equity, flexibility. Instead, most households operate on thin margins. When costs rise even modestly, budgets strain immediately. There's no fat to cut because there was no fat to begin with. Housing deserves special attention because it dominates household budgets and has become the most visible manifestation of how inflation creates permanent affordability crises. Mortgage rates in 2025 remain above 7%, nearly triple the rates available just 4 years ago. This increase doesn't just make borrowing more expensive. It fundamentally changes who can afford to buy homes. A family that could have qualified for a mortgage at 3% rates in 2021 finds themselves completely priced out at 7%. Monthly payments on the same house have effectively doubled, even if the home's purchase price stayed constant. But home prices haven't stayed constant. They've risen dramatically. Even as rates increased throughout 2023 and 2024, home values in many markets continued climbing. Limited inventory, demographic demand from millennials reaching peak home buying age, and investors purchasing properties for rentals all kept prices elevated. By late 2024 and into 2025, prices finally began plateauing in some markets, but they haven't fallen enough to restore affordability. The result is a lost generation of first-time homebuyers. Millennials and Gen Z, who should be entering the housing market, find ownership permanently out of reach. Down payments require savings they can't accumulate because rent consumes so much of their income. Even when they save enough, qualifying for mortgages at current rates with current home prices exceeds their debt-to-income ratios. Meanwhile, renting offers no relief. Rents surged during the pandemic and post-pandemic period, driven by the same factors affecting home prices. Landlords, facing higher mortgage costs, property taxes, maintenance expenses, and insurance premiums, passed those costs to tenants. Monthly rents in many cities reached all-time highs. Here's the trap. Once rents rise, they rarely fall significantly. Landlords operate on the principle that nominal prices should never decrease. They'll offer move-in specials or 1 month free rather than actually lowering the monthly rent figure. This means even when market conditions soften, renters who moved during the peak or renewed leases recently are stuck paying elevated rates indefinitely. For those who moved during 2021 to 2023, the new baseline is simply more expensive. Your rent might not be rising 10% annually anymore, but it's also not dropping back to pre-inflation levels. You're permanently paying more, and that elevated cost becomes your new normal. Official inflation figures show rent growth slowing, but they don't show rent levels declining. That distinction matters enormously for household budgets. The housing crisis compounds other inflation effects. When you're spending 40 or 50% of income on housing, you have little flexibility for other rising costs. Grocery inflation hits harder, transportation costs hurt more. You can't save, can't build emergency funds, can't invest for retirement. Housing inflation doesn't just make housing expensive, it makes everything else unaffordable by consuming the budget space that could absorb other price increases. As we look toward the end of 2025 and into 2026, several trends seem clear. The Federal Reserve continues signaling rate cuts, with markets pricing in a near certainty of a quarter-point reduction. The goal is to support the economy without reigniting inflation. But this balancing act remains precarious. Inflation at 3% remains well above the Fed's 2% target. Some economists argue we should accept this new equilibrium, that 3% inflation is manageable and trying to force it lower risks unnecessary economic pain. Others insist that settling for 3% means accepting permanent erosion of purchasing power, especially for those whose wages don't keep pace. Complicating matters are potential policy changes. Tariffs have been proposed or implemented on various imports, and economic analysis suggests these will raise consumer prices. When import costs increase, companies pass those costs to customers. This creates inflation pressure independent of monetary policy. The Fed can't control tariff-induced price increases through interest rates. Supply chain issues, while improved from pandemic-era disruptions, haven't completely normalized. Climate change continues creating agricultural challenges that affect food prices. Geopolitical tensions threaten energy supplies. Any of these factors could trigger new price spikes that restart the inflation cycle. On the positive side, wage growth has been outpacing inflation since May 2023. If this trend continues, real wages will eventually recover and perhaps exceed pre-pandemic levels. Some analysts point to tight labor markets as reason for optimism. When workers are scarce, employers must raise wages to attract talent. This could create sustained wage growth that finally, after decades, gives workers meaningful purchasing power gains. But this optimism requires sustained economic growth, continued low unemployment, and inflation that doesn't reignite. These conditions are hardly guaranteed. Recessions happen, labor markets loosen, and when they do, workers lose their bargaining power immediately. For the typical household, the reality of 2025 is that everything still feels expensive because everything is expensive. The disconnect between official inflation figures and lived experience isn't perception versus reality. It's comprehensive reality versus limited measurement. Official inflation at 3% captures price changes for a standardized basket of goods. It doesn't capture shrinkflation, where you're paying the same for less product. It doesn't capture skimpflation, where you're paying the same for worse quality. It doesn't capture that your wages have been falling behind prices for years, creating a purchasing power deficit you can't make up. It doesn't capture that housing has become structurally unaffordable, permanently altering what's possible for your financial future. When you combine these hidden costs, true inflation, the real erosion of your standard of living, runs far higher than 3%. Maybe it's 5%. Maybe 7, maybe more. The exact figure depends on your circumstances, but the direction is universal. You're losing ground. Understanding this matters because it changes how you respond. If you believe inflation is just 3% and temporary, you might wait it out, assuming things will return to normal. But if you recognize the structural changes, the hidden costs, the long-term wage stagnation, you understand that adaptation is necessary. Normal isn't coming back. This is the new normal. Acting accordingly means protecting your purchasing power through assets that keep pace with real inflation, demanding compensation that reflects true cost increases, and recognizing that official statistics tell only part of the story. The hidden costs of inflation in 2025 reveal a system that measures what's convenient rather than what's true. Shrinkflation and skimpflation hide in plain sight. Real wages stagnate for decades. Housing becomes unaffordable. And through it all, we're told inflation is under control. Just 3%, nothing to worry about. But you know better. You see it in your grocery receipt. You feel it in your budget. You live it every day. The gap between what they say and what you experience isn't confusion. It's the difference between headline numbers and hidden reality. And in 2025, that reality is clear. Inflation costs far more than they're willing to admit. If this gave you a new perspective on what inflation really means and how it's affecting your life, hit that subscribe button. Understanding the hidden costs is the first step to protecting yourself from them. The numbers lie, but your experience doesn't. Trust what you see and plan accordingly.